Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming out tonight. This is a lovely crowd and a lovely turnout. I'm going to apologize a little bit that it's a little bit warm in here, but we have the air conditioners going, so it should be a little bit better as we go. And also, in case anyone's wondering, there is a restroom on this floor through the exit, and then make a left. So we are very thrilled and proud to host two amazing writers. Alison Bechdel, as you presumably know, did the long-running comic strip Dykes to Watch Out For, and then just a number of years ago released Fun Home, the graphic memoir that was hugely beloved and everybody read. And then just this year she released a new graphic memoir called Are You My Mother? And with Alison today is Katie Roiphe, who is also a writer, and she has written a novel and a number of nonfiction works, including The Morning After and Uncommon Arrangements, and also just released is a collection of essays called In Praise of Messy Lives, which I know someone who's reading it and says it's really good. So so they're going to talk with each other. There's going to be a little slide presentation, and I'll get these lights out once you're ready to start that. And then we're going to have some Q&A, and then we'll have a signing. So thank you, guys.
Thanks. Hi.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm so thrilled to be here, and I'm especially thrilled, as many people noticed from my near-fawning New York Times review of this book, it's one of my favorite books.
She didn't say one bad thing. It was really exciting.
I didn't say one bad thing. I think they even toned it down, I hate to say. Like, the editors were like, this is too much. So aside from that somewhat undignified review, I do think Alison's one of the most exciting, innovative, and interesting, fascinating writers writing today. And one thing I want to delve into is my own sister asked to borrow a copy of the book from me over the summer. And I was my first response was like, no. And I thought, it's really socially unacceptable to say that. And I actually had the galley as well, because I'd been reviewing it. So it wasn't even my only copy of the book, but it was like my only hardcover. And I kind of ended up lending it to her, but I felt really anxious about it. And I thought, what if she doesn't give it back? And is she going to keep it for a really long time? And I think that sort of over-the-top kind of love of this book and investment in this book is pretty common. And I've just noticed from people I know who've read it, people sort of really, really, really love this book in an unusual way. And I kind of want to delve into that, like the whys and the hows of that.
Can I tell you something? Just today, I read this very interesting review of the book by Heather Love. Do you know her? She's an academic. And she said she thinks the book itself is a transitional object.
Oh, that's a really interesting analysis. Maybe it's true.
Because one of the things I write about in the book is Donald Winnicott's idea of how teddy bears or blankets function as a transitional objects for kids. And she made this funny case that the book itself was a kind of transitional object for me, I guess, like my.
Or did she mean for readers as well?
I don't know. Actually, I should go back and see.
But maybe for readers as well.
Maybe.
Wow, that is interesting. So one thing I was going to ask you starting out is, it's interesting that readers should have such a strong identification with this book, because the story you're telling is so quirky, so idiosyncratic, so specific, so much really unique to you. But it does seem like, and even people who didn't have that kind of mother, who had some different other kind of difficult mother, still somehow really, I don't even know if identify is kind of too simple a word for how they feel about it, but the book seems to really help them enter or look at their experience in a different way. Do you think that that's true? And why do you think that could be? Is there anything, obviously, you've probably encountered a lot of readers telling you their own stories.
I have. I feel sort of like a therapist lately. I'm getting all these really intense emails from people. You know, I had that same experience after writing Fun Home. People would come up to me and say, "Oh my God, this is just like my family," and then they would proceed to describe a family nothing like my family. And I decided in that case it was just the act of telling the truth about a family or revealing family secrets that people found empowering or exciting. And I knew that my story in Fun Home was really highly personal and idiosyncratic, but I got emboldened from that, since people seem to relate anyhow, to sort of push it even further in this book about my mother, which I think is really a very deeply strange book.
But I wonder about that, because a lot of people tell the truth about their families in memoirs, in novels. It's not like nobody tells the truth about their family. I think it's something about the way you tell the truth about your family. It must be. There's something very specific about this book. And obviously that's an impossible question to answer that I've just given you.
You don't think it's just because I have like archival backup, like I have diary entries and newspaper clippings?
Well, that is quite interesting. But I think maybe it's partly that people are, it's that you're writing in your own reluctance, your guilt, you write the whole process of the kind of, you're not kind of seamlessly doing it with this fluid, like this memoir came out perfectly whole.
I hate books like that.
You're writing into it the difficulty, which I think most people, which I don't think is very common, and the kind of guilt and the whole tormented compulsion.
I tried to do that, and I wonder if in this book about my mother, which ultimately became a book about writing the book, if that wasn't maybe a little too much, turning back in on itself.
Well, it seems also interesting because this book is so much about writing and the process of writing, so you can see why writers would care about it. But it seems that also non-writers also felt some identification there too. I mean, imagine the response you're getting from readers is not just from writers.
Yes. People, it's pushing some button about people's mothers. I don't really know yet. Maybe in the Q&A we will find out.
Well, speaking of this complicated mother question, you have this great quote from Virginia Woolf after she wrote To the Lighthouse. She says, "I ceased to be obsessed by my mother. I no longer have hear her voice. I do not see her. I expressed some very long felt and deeply felt emotion. And in expressing it, I explained it and then laid it to rest." And so after writing about her mother Into the Lighthouse, she presumably felt this way. Did you feel this way after writing this book? Did you feel like you resolved it and could walk away and you don't hear the voice anymore?
No, not at all. I hoped that I would make that happen. I hoped that I could engineer it, but it didn't really happen yet. I think what I learned with my book Fun Home is that books aren't really over when they're over. Like, they keep living in the world and people's responses change. My family's reactions change with time, and maybe at some point I will feel that kind of cathartic release from my mother's constant critical presence in my head, but it has not happened yet. It's been a little heightened, if anything.
Heightened, like you still hear her say it, or you just have it in your head more?
Both. She reads book reviews. That's what she does all day, and she's always excited when she sees a bad review of something, and she's got to tell me about it. And I always feel like there's some implicit little message there for me, like, be careful. Although when I did actually get a bad review, she was irate on my behalf. That was kind of cool.
Well, and did she tell you, obviously, did she tell you her reaction to this book? Because so much of this book is
No.
about her reaction to this book that
I know.
it almost feels like, I mean, we kind of feel like we know her reaction to this book, but did she actually give you a satisfying reaction?
No.
You have a lot of scenes where you're trying to get her to react and she doesn't really react.
That is all I got.
That's all you got.
Everything I got is in the book. I don't really have a slide presentation. We just threw some pictures together. So I'll just change those so you have something else to look at every now and then. No, I think you don't have to turn the lights off. I think people can see, okay?
Yes.
She's maddening. I mean, I did hope that, I mean, one thing I really wanted to achieve in this book was to let my mother know how much I loved her. And you would think a person might respond to that by saying, thank you, or, oh, that was so moving, or any number of things I can think of. But no, I got none of that. I know that she's happy, but I only know that because I know her strange ways, and I know that when she's not saying something, I know I know what she's thinking. I'm sorry. I'm not giving a satisfactory response because I never got one.
Well, it's funny. My older sister, who's also a writer, once said to me, she said, both of us, it's really pathetic. It's like our whole careers could be reduced to those drawings that you hang up on the refrigerator with magnets when you're a child. Like, we just want our mother to be like, can you put that up on the refrigerator with a magnet? And, while I resisted this interpretation at the time, it was kind of true, right? Like, you do just want your mother to be like, this is the most brilliant piece of work. And really what anyone else says is irrelevant. The New York Times, who cares?
Yeah.
You want your mother to put the thing up on the refrigerator with the magnet, right?
Totally. Your mother would actually do that, though, right?
My mother puts all the books on the refrigerator with the magnet, but she might even over magnetize the books. One could argue, but the thing is, I do think that moment where you're looking for that response and you don't get it is complicated. I wanted to ask you about the ending of the book, which I just thought was...
Wait, can I say something before that?
Yes.
I feel like what you just said is why I write, to get from other people the response I didn't get from her. But that you are a very prolific writer and you didn't have that problem. So that's interesting. I always think people write out of some kind of deep lack. But perhaps you disprove that.
Well, I was going to ask you that. Deflecting off of me. No, we're not interested in me here. Deflecting onto you. I was wondering about that in the sense that would you have been a writer or an artist or have been that child creating that beautiful office, that you draw with the Dr. Seuss, plexiglass? Would you have been that child if you had just had this totally well-loved, well-nurtured childhood? I
don't think I would have. I think I would be a lawyer now. I do. I'm not that there's anything wrong with that. But I think I would just probably be, not have this gnawing anxiety that's always making me make things.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. I think it's interesting because that's certainly, I think, as a parent, that no matter, even if you give your children you give them all the love they need, they're still going to be tormented and miserable. And remember that one time you didn't go to their comedy show because you flew to England, and you never make your child feel that secure that they can't sort of become some kind of writer or artist or something.
That's probably true.
But anyway, well, going back to this mother thing, when you finished the book, did you feel, obviously a lot of the book is about guilt and writing about your family and feeling and grappling with this kind of both the compulsion to write and the sort of shady impulse, whatever it is, but then also the guilt about it. But when you finished the book, did you stop feeling guilty or no?
No, I have been racked with guilt and shame ever since I got my copy in the mail. It's been really awful. I had a hard time writing the book. I was very kind of miserable writing the book, and I thought I would be released from it once it was published, but that didn't happen, mostly because as soon as I got the book, I found a billion little tiny mistakes, little tiny drawing errors that sort of haunted me. But no, we don't care about that. Also because I felt like I had exposed my mother in a way that she was not really completely on board with.
Well, I was going to talk about that final scene of the book where you, not to spoil it, or maybe to spoil it. I guess I'm going to spoil it. I'm going to go ahead and spoil it. But I'll be vague. I'll vaguely spoil it. If you, at the final scene of the book, you've very almost brutally anatomized all these things that were wrong with the way your mother mothered. And yet, you really generously come out of that with her having taught you somehow to be an artist. She gave you the way to escape this difficult situation. And in a way, it is a book of love, because she does, I mean, you sort of end with this thing that she's given you. I mean, if you can ask anything of a parent, it's that they give you the way to escape. I mean, that's what else do we need in life?
Yeah, I feel like in many ways my mother kind of threw me overboard, but then she threw me this lifesaver, which was a great thing. I know, I shouldn't really, I feel ridiculous complaining about my mother. She was like a pretty good mother. Well, maybe she wasn't. It's such a huge taboo to say anything bad about your mother.
Well, but maybe this is what people are identifying with, because she wasn't the worst mother in the world. And I think there was some nasty reviews where people were like, you didn't beat her up. She wasn't like so terrible.
Yeah.
But the thing that I think the thing that touches a nerve with lots of people with different kinds of pretty good mothers, like good enough mothers, is that she didn't give you something you really needed. And when you describe those scenes, like the scene where she stops giving you the goodnight kiss and how much she favors your brothers, and they're little things in a way, but for a child, they're huge. Like, it's the weather. Your mother is like the weather.
Yeah.
It's like a storm, it's like a tornado. So I think that the universal thing here is that, and that what you're writing about that actually interests people, is that those little ways in which someone is a terrible mother actually hugely affect you and change your, and that's what Winnicott also discusses.
Yeah, but he also talked about the good enough mother, and most people are good enough. My mother was certainly good enough, or I would be psychotic, and I'm not, pretty much.
Now, what about, just to step back, interestingly, if someone were to describe this book, like, we have a book, there's going to be a lot of scenes in a shrink's office, there's going to be a lot about the person trying to write a book, there's going to be a lot about, like, how does she really feel about her mother? You would kind of, if I just described that book, you would think, how can that really be a book? Because it's so interior. It's so many internal states of mind. There's so much in it where nothing at all happens. Like, there's not, there's stories in it, but so much of what you're after is this sort of really complex internal states. And what I'm kind of interested in your describing is how you get that on the page, because I think that's one of the truly dazzling feats of this book, is to take these little things happening in your head and actually put them on the page.
Okay, now I'm going to jump ahead here. I do have a slight little presentation, because I'm going to show you one of these, like, internal things that I tried to find a way to get out. And this, you asked me, we didn't really rehearse this. I only just met Katie, and we didn't rehearse this, but you did say you wanted to talk about the thing about why do I use pictures?
Do you want me to? I'll ask that now.
That too.
And combining with my other question. This is so spontaneous. Great. Combining with my other question, I was thinking about what would this book be without pictures? Like, what if you just wrote a prose memoir, and there are certain things that seem to be accomplished in this memoir that just actually you really couldn't do if you just had words. So, again, linked to this question about how do you externalize these internal things, how does having pictures, what does it free you to do, and what does it allow you to do that words would not allow you to do?
Well, I picked this little passage here where I find a childhood drawing. And I feel like the reason I am a cartoonist, the reason I write visually, is because that's how I see, if I could show you pictures now, I would explain myself better. I can't really think without pictures. And so this scene, I looked at the childhood drawing. I'm examining it, and it reminded me of a illustration in a kid's book. So the image keeps leading me. I went and found the picture in the Dr. Seuss book, and here's the page. And what I learned when I'm looking for this keep out sign, so I find a picture of a keep out sign. You can't really see that, but there's a tiny little keep out sign down there at that little doorway. And in the text on this page, Dr. Seuss is talking about a plexiglass dome, which is a phrase I used to use with my first good therapist about to describe my mother's kind of absence and distance. It was like she was sitting in plain sight in the living room, but you couldn't talk to her because she had this, what seemed like a plexiglass dome over her head. So I was very surprised to find that word in this potent childhood picture book. And I don't know, then the Dr. Seuss drawing later, as I thought about it and looked at it more, I realized it was like a womb. And so then I was able to make an analogy to an actual fetus and to me inside of my mother. And that this is what that looks like on the page of the book, like these images linked in a kind of argument, like it's an essay, but it's the connecting things are not words but images.
And I guess, I mean, in a way, it's sort of Proustian, these connections, like finding this thing which leads you to another association, but you don't have to have transitions. So in a way, without the transitions, if you had an essay, there would be like a million transitions here, because we're going from like Winnicott to Virginia Woolf to this, to that, to Dr. Seuss. So we'd have 1,000 transitions. But they'd kill you, those transitions.
Yeah, but sometimes I feel like I could have used more transitions. Sometimes I go back and look at this book, and it just often feels like non sequiturs, like it needed a little more something. But I'm not the most accurate or objective reader of the book. I feel like I don't have enough distance.
But part of what that this allows you to do with just the sheer fact of pictures, and I'm curious what you think about this, is that it allows a kind of simultaneity that words do not, because we have to read words in order. You know, we kind of are reading them one after another, as one does. But with pictures and words, and with your quotes, for instance, in that incredibly amazing Dr. Seuss page, you have a Winnicott quote, you have the Dr. Seuss drawing, you have the letter from your father, you have 16 different things going on simultaneously, and you can telegraph that to the reader in this incredibly graceful way where they don't have to go from here to here to here to here. So that connectivity, which this form, I think, and I guess I wish you could speak to this more, because in a way this form, I'm calling it a form, but it's really only your form. You know, like, they're not like 16,000 people doing what you do. So this form you've created or invented is allowing for connections from one thing to another that I think are true to life. You're sitting there with your girlfriend and you're having another thought. But how do you show that if you're doing it in prose?
Yeah, when I first started writing my book Fun Home, I was doing it in a word processing program, just writing down ideas. I didn't know how else to get started, but I couldn't really get anywhere. I would write and write, and then I'd hit a dead end until I started writing in a drawing program in Adobe Illustrator. When I started seeing the page as a two-dimensional field where pictures would go and how, where things would be linked or juxtaposed. But what happens when I'm just trying to write a sentence, like if I get asked to do something simple like write a blurb for a book, every sentence that I write, every word that I write, I feel like I could go off in 18 different directions from that word. And I think lots of people feel that way. It's a kind of attention deficit disorder or something. But in text, very good, gifted writers can manage to do that with just prose. But I find that having access to pictures enables me to do several things at once, like I'm trying to do.
And, well, I mean, I think writers can do it, but it's clunkier. You know, I mean, it just is. If you were going to do Dr. Seuss and Winnicott and Virginia Woolf and My Dad's Letter and this, you just wouldn't be able to do it quite as gracefully, I don't think.
Or it might come across just as more experimental, whereas this, I think, is fairly accessible.
Yeah, it's definitely more accessible. But the other thing is there something about this medium that you've created that lends itself to the way people think and remember? I mean, is that maybe part of one of the answers that we were talking about before in the beginning about why people are identifying with this book? Is there something you're capturing about the way memory works and the way family works that, and I think specifically, which I loved, the scene where you're talking to your mother about something important and she's like going on about the plumber and the pipes. And it was just something about this way of representing what's going on in your head and then what you're saying in contrast, which you can't do in prose quite the same way. Like you're thinking this, but you're saying this. You're thinking this, but you're saying this.
Right.
In this really graphic way. Does that help people kind of represent, or how is it a different way of representing, you know, one's family experience, for instance?
Well, I don't know a lot about neuroscience stuff. I find all of that kind of boring for some reason. So I don't know technically, does memory function in a purely visual way? I don't know, but I know it's pretty visual, and so I feel like it's a way to access stuff in a deep, immediate way. In terms of my family, I think just the act of drawing my family members, which took a lot of, it was hard to do. It took me a long time to get comfortable with the way of drawing them, gave me a weird kind of access or empathy to them, which maybe, I don't know, having to externalize them, having to draw them, having to touch them in a way was kind of interesting.
I was going to ask you that because it's almost hard to see your parents, actually. Like, actually see what they look like, because you have so many weird fantasies and ideas and, like, feelings about them that you don't actually see them quite, as a child especially.
Yeah.
Like, what your parents look like is very confusing.
Plus, they're always changing anyhow.
Plus, they're changing, and you have a huge stretch of time.
Yeah.
So you had trouble finding them, but then you found them.
Sort of. I found a way to draw them, you know, a shorthand that seemed to resonate. I don't know. Wait, I have some notes too.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if they make any sense though. I was thinking about the arc of this book, which isn't really a very clear narrative. You said something along those lines earlier, which made me think of this. Do you remember what you said?
About how there's nothing happens, you mean?
Yeah.
It's all
nothing
interior.
happens.
Nothing
It's all
happens.
interior. Right.
Well, something happens. I didn't mean it like
Well,
that. But
no.
Right, there's not an external story exactly. It's all, there's not much action. It's all interior states and kind of things that go on, for instance, inside a psychiatrist's room or in your head or those kind of things. The progress is all in your head.
And I think comics, you know, traditionally has been a very action-oriented way of communicating. I mean, it's perfectly designed for that in the way film is. I mean, you're seeing stuff happen. But I think comics can, you know, like in a movie, it's harder to get the same sense of interiority or immersion in a person's consciousness, except in like a, you know, weird experimental movie. But I feel like I've been trying to get comics to go more inside, to be able to convey subjective experience more. When comics first started getting like taken seriously, Charles McGrath wrote a piece in the New York Times Magazine about this new, you know, comics can be literature kind of article, and but he did say that one thing comics isn't great at is lyrical emotion or nuanced feelings. I forget how exactly he put it, but I felt kind of excited by that. I took it as a challenge, like I want to figure out how to make comics do that.
Well, and I think, and the flip side of that, to what we were talking about before, when I was saying how do you externalize these interior states, in a way the form brought action. I mean, if you were to try to write this thing in prose, it would be harder because people would get, it's just so much, just how much can we read about someone sitting in a psychiatrist's office, except that you brought action to this kind of subject that doesn't have a lot of action in it. So I think the form also brought, the kind of like Superman jumping over tall buildings to this subject. In a lot of ways, and it made it dynamic and as you said, accessible. And I mean, I just don't think a lot of people would be able to read a book that had all this Winnicott and all this Virginia Woolf and all these other things in it, and was so thinky, except for that you brought this really dynamic form to it. So maybe you brought a little of the Superman and the tall buildings.
Maybe I did.
To the psychological struggle.
I like that. Good one.
So, should we open up for questions? Questions from the audience. I have more questions if you don't have questions. Anyone? Yeah.
I have a question. I'm curious about kind of how you get started on your process in writing something. Do you visualize it first? Is it like a story? Like how exactly? And then in terms of your process of creating, what does that look like? Is it more of you visually drawing something out or thinking it through? Like what does that look like?
That's a really perfect question because I actually have slides queued up and I can show you. And I apologize if any of you have seen me do this talk. Oh, wait, hang on. They're here. Hang on. They weren't as close as I thought, but here they are. This is Adobe Illustrator. This is how I start writing on a page like this, where I have a little grid that it's a template so I can make any combination of panel outlines that I need. So I'm already thinking about what the page is going to look like. And then I can just start typing right on the page. I draw a little text box and start typing with my digital font. And it's really a wonderful, flexible way to write because I can change the layout really quickly without having to erase stuff or throw it away. And I'm always thinking very much about the space of the page. Like this sentence here would be fine if I were writing prose, but if I can make it a little shorter, I can get an extra 1/8 of an inch for the drawing. And there's always this battle between the words and the pictures. And as I'm writing, I'm also thinking about what's going to go in these boxes. I'm not just making random boxes. I can't even really explain to you what I'm thinking. I somehow know there's going to be a picture there, and I have a rough idea of what it is. But I don't actually draw it. I might do little sketches, like what I'm doing here is placing that sketch of my mother with the little fetus inside of her as I made a sketch, and then I can just stick it there. And I've obviously copied the Dr. Seuss drawing and found a picture of a fetus on the internet. So it's a kind of drawing. It's like I'm not doing all the hard work of making actual drawings, but I'm designing the page, which feels like drawing. And then I print that Illustrator page out. Once I get it written to my satisfaction, I start sketching right on the page, really, really rough at first. And as I'm drawing, I do a lot of posing for all the different characters in the book, or I use family snapshots. This is a picture of me and my mom. And I use all that visual research to refine the drawings until I have you can't see that very good, but that's my really good pencil sketch, which I then ink, put into Photoshop, color. That's what the color looks like. I shade it on a separate piece of paper, which I also scan into Photoshop, and then stick those all together. And I never know what it's going to look like until this moment when I put all the layers together, and then add the text. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but that's my little routine.
Anyone else? Yeah, back there. Yeah.
Are the characters in your book different from the characters in real life in some ways that you thought about because when you were making the cartoons?
Are the characters in the book different from the real-life characters in how they look?
No, in how they act.
No, well, I tried really, really hard to make them true to life. I mean, true to my experience. It's my experience of my mother. I'm sure she doesn't really identify completely with the person I've created, but I didn't try to disguise anyone or change them. I was trying really hard to get the real people.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I just wondered if maybe the characters took off on you.
Oh, no. I didn't let them, I mean, I think that's what, maybe that's, often I say there's not really any difference between fiction and nonfiction. It's just whether you, call people by the same names or not. But that is a really big difference, and it would have been interesting to just let my mother, take off on her own as a character. Maybe I'll do that in my next book.
Other questions? Yeah.
Earlier on, you said you were moments where you thought you were questioning whether the self-referential aspect of writing the story got too intense. How did you balance that? How did you think about it while you were doing it? That the degree to which you're capturing your own consciousness while you're trying to tell a story might become, the reader might be like, holy moly, I'm out of here. What really, how did you figure that out?
She's asking, how did I balance the intense self-referentiality of the story in a way that wasn't completely overwhelming for the reader? I don't know if I did. I think I actually was teaching a comics class last spring, and the students, one of the books we read was my book, and I think some of these college kids were, they found it a little too self-reflexive, I think. But I think that's because they're young, and they don't, I think it's not necessarily because it's too self-reflexive. I just think they're not the audience, and they haven't thought about their lives long enough.
But is one of the things, just to step in, isn't one of the things you did to undercut that a little bit humor? Because in a way, the book is so funny at certain key points, and it seems like that is one way to what actually cuts against that feeling like I'm in somebody's head is that it makes you laugh. And laughter, creates air on the page.
Yeah. Well, I tried to do that.
I would say you did do it, and that's why I was going to say that it might be self-referential, but there's that aspect of it I think is what a lot of people recognize, that if you try to grapple with your mother, which you're not supposed to be doing anyway, you're going to have layers of whatever going on. The fact that you're tracking all that and still sort of able to observe it and make it helpful.
It was very
helpful for the rest of us for drafting our own.
Oh, thank you. It was very confusing, though. I would.
But did you do that on purpose? It sounds like you didn't. Now that since you look so bewildered, did you on purpose try to make it use the humor in that way, or not? That wasn't your thinking, or it just came out like that?
I try not to be too conscious about humor, or even to think. I get nervous even talking about being funny because I feel like then I'll never be able to do it. And I don't think this book was. I think my book Fun Home was a lot funnier. This one I think has a different feel. It's not really very funny, and most of the funny lines are just things I wrote down that my mother said. But wait, I was going to say something. Humor.
Working against the self-reflectiveness.
The self-reflexiveness, well, sorry, lost it.
Or that people recognize what you're going through, because a lot of us go through the same thing. You try to grapple, and in some way, process of mind, you kind of capture it in a way that I would guess is familiar. You try to come to terms with some large figure in their life.
Good.
And I just wondered if you'd like to meet my mother.
Oh, I'm sorry. She's easier to write a memoir about, though, now that she's dead.
Other questions? Yeah, in the back.
You talked a little bit about your process of interpretation of age, but one of the things that amazed me about this book is how many different time frames, how many different states of mind, and it's sort of layered over each other, and it made sense to you throughout, which was
Oh, that's really good to hear.
yeah. And I'm curious about the kind of outlining and vision structuring process.
Oh my God. At one point I had this huge, like 6 by 4 foot chart on my wall with hundreds of little Post-its and index cards and notes and a grid. It was a very unwieldy story to write. I mean, mostly because there was no story. I had to find the story in all of these different strands. At a certain point, I realized there were actually through lines. Like there was a story of my mother's life, like as, you know, going to college in the 50s and getting married in the 60s. There was my fixation with Donald Winnicott. There was a relationship I had in my 20s. There were these layers of things that were starting to become clear, but they were, I don't know. Again, I can't, if I could show you the chart, it would be much better. It was a lot of, it wasn't really an outline, it was just this constantly evolving Excel spreadsheet, really. I mean, I had it on my computer as well as on the wall. Sorry.
But it sounds like you're very organized about your research and your creative process. It's not like you just sit there and do it.
No, oh my God, it's really organized and really belabored. No, I wish it just came out of me. That didn't happen.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi. This is kind of another process question, but I'm wondering what the process of creating this story was like compared to writing Fun Home. Because I imagine two very different.
Yes. She said, what was the process of writing this book like compared with writing Fun Home? And I have to go back to another thing in this review I just read by Heather Love, because it was really cool. She said that, well, she was talking about some people who criticized Are You My Mother for being shapeless, for not having like a conventional narrative. And she said it was that Fun Home was like a classical temple built over Minoan ruins. Oh, and that Fun Home is about an Oedipal struggle. It's about, you know, this pretty straightforward battle with my dad. But the story of me and my mother is pre-Oedipal. That's where the drama with the mother happens in these early years, these, you know, really murky, inaccessible years that Donald Winnicott shed so much light on. But that is necessarily a less linear kind of a story. So I think maybe out of necessity, this book is more complicated. Donald Winnicott also said a really cool thing. He said, the father must be murdered, but the mother can be dismantled. And I think, I keep wanting to say it the other way.
Kind of do that.
What?
Do that, your books.
Well, I hope so. I kind of want to say the father can be murdered, the mother must be dismantled, because it's a lot easier to murder someone than dismantle them, as I discovered.
Other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned before, I think, about how the process was kind of emotionally difficult and challenging, and I feel like anything like personal is going to be like that. When you're dealing with that kind of thing, or like an artist has a love for their work, but also, you know, that kind of work, that kind of story they're telling is almost like painful or like difficult to deal with. Like, how do you forge through that? Like, how do you get through to the end of the work? You know, it's kind of a hard, weird question.
How do you get through to the end of something when it's so difficult, if it's so emotionally painful?
Like when it's something that you kind of love but have to pay for at the same time.
Oh, because I love writing and drawing, but this particular writing and drawing project is excruciating.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, like, emotionally, like, is there anything or any perspective that you...
Well, it helps having a publisher breathing down your neck. I was way late on this book. It took me a couple years past the deadline I had promised, and that was nerve-wracking. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, yeah, I was like living through all of these experiences of shame and rejection and humiliation. Like, I was like steeped in that stuff all day for like years, and it was compounded by the fact that I was going through menopause. Which no one should talk about. No one's interested in that unless you happen to be one of the people who are at this moment going through menopause. So I won't talk about that anymore.
Was there a moment, sort of related to this question, where you had a revelation that you were going to put the difficulty of the process into the book itself? So was there a moment where you thought, I'm going to put my struggle about writing this book into the book itself, or did you always put the struggle into the book? Like, rather than just tell the story of your relationship with your mother, at some point, maybe at the beginning, you decided, I'm going to put in the difficulty of telling this story.
No, I didn't put it in, but I did have an idea at the very beginning that the book would be about writing Fun Home, about writing the memoir about my father. And my agent said, you can't do that. That's like, no one's going to have the patience for that. That's just too self-indulgent. And so I avoided that. I didn't do that. For a couple years, I worked on this other kind of version of the book that when I finally showed that to my agent, she said, this doesn't make any sense. So then I went back to my original idea of like, it made the book about writing the other book. And then all of my process and difficulties writing this book became a part of it, and I just let that happen.
So it was later in the...
Yes, it was not a part of the original conception at all.
And once you had that, did it make it easier to write it suddenly?
No,
or no, it was still hard to write.
It was still
Never
really
easy to
hard.
write.
At least I felt like I was gonna finish it at that point, but it wasn't wasn't great. The only moment of true just pleasure and inspiration was one day when I envisioned Virginia Woolf and Donald Winnicott meeting in
the park.
The park. That just came out of nowhere, but it was the only thing that happened like that.
But I'm sure I'm not alone in the audience in saying this. I hope there was like a moment where you looked at this book and thought, and had pleasure in it, and thought, this is great, or I'm happy it came out this way, or some like satisfaction, some untormented moment of moment of satisfaction.
I actually had a couple of months of feeling really good about it when I was finishing the drawing, when I was just completely, my life was turned over to drawing like 20 hours a day. But then it ended. Like when I saw the actual book, that all went away. So but it was great while it lasted. That experience of just being immersed in the production of it was very wonderful. I mean, that's all one can hope for, I think.
Yeah, that's a lot. Any last questions? Yeah. Can you stand, because we can't hear you?
Hi.
I'm wondering about your use of color. Because obviously you have sort of one color thing in front of the other color, one color thing. So I'm curious just like why you say to go with a shade and not color or not
when I was writing Fun Home, my original idea was to keep it black and white, to make it just black and white as a kind of fuck you to my father, who was very obsessed with color. And I wanted to prove that you could, tell a nuanced story in black and white. I mean, I became a cartoonist, so I didn't have to deal with color. But then we realized, talking to the art department, like there was a way to get a very cool effect by just turning my gray ink wash shading green, and I'm glad I did that, and I think it's very cool. And then with Are You My Mother, I liked working with two colors, with black and another color, so I kept doing that, but just had to pick a different color, and red was like pretty much the only other color there was. All right.
So, there's this element where you are so personal in what you write, and you're so willing to expose yourself and, like draw yourself having sex and draw yourself in the bathroom and just tell the truth. And there's also this other element where I think you're a very deeply private person. And the reason I say that is because I saw a drawing you did of yourself having to give yourself a pep talk before giving, I think it was the staff at the post office, some chocolates for Christmas.
Oh, yeah.
And you were having to psych yourself up just to do that little thing. And I want to know how those two things coexist. Because I have those two things in myself.
Oh, okay.
I find it very difficult to live my life. Wanting to be seen and wanting to be invisible at the same time.
Yeah, she's asking, how do I reconcile the fact that I show all these really personal moments from my life with the fact that I'm basically almost autistically shy. You wouldn't know that because I do pretty good sitting in public. I'm functioning pretty well, I think. I don't know. I guess it's being my public self. I feel like I've created this kind of almost this character of myself that enables me, I can hide behind it. I think it's accurate. I think it's me, but it's still like an avatar of me. But when I'm just out trying to give the ladies at the bank a Christmas present, I'm just paralyzed with shyness and anxiety. But that's because I'm not talking about myself.
Well, but a lot of writers are shy because the way that they can express themselves is in writing, and they can't be comfortable in a room. So they compensate in these elaborate ways.
Because we have to always go out in public and talk like this.
Yeah.
Virginia Woolf didn't have to. Imagine if she'd had to go on an author's tour.
She was actually good at public speaking. She was surprisingly good at public speaking. Do we have time for one more question?
Let's do one more.
One more last question. Yes, in the back. He's been waiting.
How do you deal with the frustration of not being able to relay exactly what, particularly your mother, said? Anybody would be difficult, but I feel like there's a certain relationship with mothers where their words can drive us so in one direction or another that calling something nonfiction or whatever, and not being able to actually have everything they've ever said before.
How do I deal with the frustration of supposedly writing nonfiction about my real family and my real conversations with my mother, but I of course don't have a recording of everything. I hate that. I wish I had a video camera on my shoulder all the time. But no, that would become impossible because you don't have time to watch it. I feel like I'm getting to feel a little more confident and free in reconstructing things like conversations I had when I was 3. I try not to do that too much, but you kind of have to do that. It's not. I wish I had transcripts of the actual conversation, but yeah, it is a little frustrating that I don't.
You ever look at it and kind of get burnt out and think that it's too you and not
Oh, yes. I think it's inevitably too much me and not enough her. I mean, the only way to get her true perspective would be to invite her to write her own lines, which I sort of tried to do,
Well, thank you to the Strand, and thank to all of you for coming.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks.